This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. EWA retains full editorial control over the contents of this podcast. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. What if you could earn a college degree by demonstrating your mastery of a specific set of skills rather than completing a minimum number of hours of instructional seat time? That's the premise behind a massive experiment underway in California's community colleges. Adam Echelman of CalMatters, an EWA reporting fellow, is here to tell us more. Adam, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Can you give our listeners a quick definition of competency-based education as it's being used now in some of these California community colleges?
Yeah, I think in basic terms, it's really just about learning by skills instead of by classes. You mentioned in your introduction this idea of seat time. And really, a lot of the higher education systems, as we know them, are designed around the amount of hours that a student spends in class. So an associate degree, for instance, is something like 2,000 or 3,000 hours. Every credit in a course equates to a certain number of hours, and you need those hours to get a degree. This system, called competency-based education, flips that on its head, and it says, no, we're not going to focus on the amount of hours you spend or the number of credits you get. We're just going to focus on whether you learned that skill. And if you've learned enough skills, then we'll give you the degree.
One of the misconceptions I think that's out there about competency-based education is the degree areas where you can apply it. It's not necessarily just for a professional certification like automotive skills, right?
Not at all. In fact, competency-based education started with things like English, math, philosophy. It really took root. It's actually been around since the 70s, and it's gone through various iterations. I would say the largest expansion of competency-based education took place in the late 90s with Western Governors University. You might be familiar with it. It's this massive conglomerate online university. It's actually the nation's largest university, educating something around, I think they had like 150,000 students graduating, although don't quote me on that. But anyway, they've got this giant system, and what Western Governors does is they're giving you bachelor's degrees in things like English, biology. Basically any topic they have converted into competency-based education. Now, what I wrote about was how California is taking this concept, evaluating students by skills and not the number of hours in class, and how they're adapting that to the state's community colleges or two-year institutions. And California is doing some pretty radical things.
What problem are they trying to solve or address with this approach?
One of the big challenges that California has faced, and I'd wager to say maybe every community college has faced, is a loss of students. California saw something around a 18% decline in students during the pandemic. And one of the big populations that left were older students, those students who were like over the age of 20 or so, but especially those over 30, 40, 50. They lost a lot of older students. And one of the ideas is that these students left in part because the workforce took them. They said, hey, I can get a better job somewhere else, or this degree is important, but I have urgent needs. I just can't work this degree around my schedule. And so the idea is, by offering this new model, one that advertises being more flexible, enabling people to apply their work experience to the classroom, that it might appeal more to these older adults, to somebody who's already maybe working in that field and wants to get a promotion.
The program seems to work pretty well for someone who may have a little bit of a head start with that sort of practical experience that you're talking about. Who are the students who are also being attracted to this? Is it really the ones who are in a hurry, or are they ones who are absolutely brand new to some of these fields?
Well, it's all kind of speculative at this point. I mean, as I said, there are examples of competency based education dating back to the 70s, and Western Governors University, again, is this like huge thing. There's lots of for profit universities like Capella University that use competency based education. So this is not new, but those are all bachelor's degree programs and they're all online. What I'm talking about are 2 year degrees, professional degrees, and actually, as you mentioned at the beginning, applied degrees. And ironically, a lot of those programs, like automotive mechanics, for instance, have never been done in a competency based way through public institutions. Now, I want to get back to your question. When we're looking at who is actually appealed to this, it's hard to really figure out exactly who because this is pretty unprecedented. But I went and I looked at a program in Wisconsin that actually has piloted competency based education in places like automotive mechanics. And the hypothesis that a lot of California leaders told me did kind of ring true. By and large, they found that the students who take these competency based classes tend to be a little older and they tend to want more flexibility. They don't necessarily move any faster. In fact, a lot of them are working and they actually move slower. But nonetheless, they do kind of represent that working adult.
It was interesting because you profiled one of those working adults in California where he's working on his degree, but he's also the student body president of this community college, which I thought was sort of fascinating. And he talked about that, his degree is taking him longer because he has to divide his time between his academic work and the work that he has as student body president. And I'll be honest, a cynical piece of me for a second thought, you know what? Just give up the student body president thing and focus on the degree. That's going to serve you better. But then I realized it may be that opportunity for leadership and an engagement that's keeping him interested in school.
Yeah. It was interesting also with that person that I profiled. He was initially taking classes through Coursera and Udemy, these again massive online for-profit companies, where you buy a class and you take it for a little bit. And he had heard about this pilot, this kind of new online university that California has called Calbright College. And he had heard about it and said, oh, this is better, in part because Calbright College is entirely free. And so he said, oh, I'll save some money. So he started taking classes there. And he found that even though Calbright is a competency-based education program and Coursera is not, he found the experience to be pretty much the same. So for him, he didn't exactly see the difference that this pedagogy could offer. But what he did say is that the model at Calbright College, there was a lot more student support and engagement. He had professors who would actually answer his questions, and he had classmates who he liked. And that inspired him to get involved in the student body and ultimately, become the president of the student association. And so, I think for him, he'd probably say, yeah, just having that engagement was probably one of the things that enabled him to persist at an online university.
One of the analogies I was trying to come up with for competency based education, I wanted to run it by you. And I'm wondering if it's short selling it somehow, but that was maybe going through a self checkout at a supermarket where you put in your basket the degree that you want to earn and the classes you're going to take. And then you get up to the register and you have to sort of swipe yourself out to demonstrate that you're ready to leave the store.
I think that's actually not a terrible analogy. It's definitely a self-paced system. There is a role for instructors. What instructors will do is they will design a curriculum. They'll put together videos or, selections, readings, concepts. And most importantly, they are available to answer questions. So, often there'll be like office hours. You can kind of imagine it like that, where students can come in, they can watch the videos, do the work at their own pace. But if they have a question, there's a professor that's there who can answer questions, usually just kind of walking around the room waiting for students to reach out. But there's no requirement. You don't have to come to office hours. You don't have to watch the videos at any point. You just have to prove that you have the requisite skills.
What is the response then of the folks who may be used to teaching in this sort of face to face environment? What has been the reaction to this experiment for these California colleges?
It depends. Some faculty are really, really supportive. I talked to faculty at one community college, Southwestern College, which is right near the California-Mexico border and kind of the San Diego metro. And they're piloting a competency-based model in automotive technology. And the professors there said, frankly, it wasn't that much of a revolution for them. It's pretty intuitive. Apparently, a lot of industry certifications. So you can imagine like this kind of certification an auto dealership might offer to its employees. Apparently, those kinds of programs already were what we would now consider competency based. It was all just about, proving that you as an employee could change a tire. You didn't have to sit through a classroom for a certain number of hours to gain that certification. And so for these automotive instructors, they were saying, yeah, this just feels like back to the old days where it was about what you know and not whether you sat in a class. That said, not everybody feels that way.
I would think not. And I think it would be more difficult to sell this for the humanities, for example.
Yeah, there hasn't. So in California, that's not as relevant, and I can share a little bit more about why. But there have been some serious pushback from faculty leaders in California. There's one community college that's also part of this pilot in California where basically the entire program has been stalled because the academic senate has a lot of concerns about the program. They're worried about the academic rigor of these degrees. And, ultimately they're concerned about pay too. How is this going to restructure faculty pay? What are the obligations of faculty going to be?
We're talking with Adam Echelman of CalMatters about competency-based education in California's community colleges, a project story he undertook as an EWA reporting fellow. This episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. Join them March 4th through 7th, 2024 in Austin, Texas, as they tackle the world's most critical social issues through the lens of education. Experience community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover hundreds of sessions and events already revealed featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today. Adam, what do we know about how this program is playing out? For example, you mentioned in your story that Calbright has had a little bit of a rocky road overall, getting up and going in terms of student outcomes. What do we know about the competency-based education piece of this?
There's a lot of different kinds of competency-based education. So, for instance, as you mentioned, California launched Calbright, an all online community college, a few years ago. And it's been subject to a lot of controversy. A lot of other community colleges, brick and mortar community colleges, were pretty opposed to it, in part because those colleges are also offering online classes and there's just a lot of natural competition. And there's been, there was a audit in the California state legislature that really raised some concerns about the academic success of students at Calbright College. But that was very early on in the college's career. And as time has passed, some of those metrics and the enrollment numbers have really gone up quite a lot. But that's all to say, Calbright is only one example of competency-based education. It's the more traditional model, if that makes sense. It sounds kind of funny to say it's the traditional model of a non-traditional system. But in other words, like a lot of colleges and universities across the country teach in a competency-based way through online education. So again, I'll go back to something like Western Governors University, which is this online competency-based system where you can kind of get a degree at your own pace in basically any topic. That's all one system. What California is doing on top of Calbright is that they're also about to introduce a whole new array of competency based programs at 8 other community colleges. And the reason why I really want to talk about those 8 community colleges is because they're actually doing something that's really, really unprecedented. Unlike Calbright or Western Governors University, these 8 community colleges are getting rid of the Carnegie unit. They are essentially like overhauling all of the main foundations of higher education. And I know this is a little wonky, but let me just say a little bit more for a minute. What they're doing here is they are going to reshape their financial aid system. They're reshaping the contracts on all of the faculty unions that they work with. They are reshaping their transcripts. Basically, all the things that you think about that go behind higher education are changing in California in order to accommodate this rapid expansion, or I should say massive expansion, of competency-based education.
Well, it sounds, unprecedented, as you said, but also I can sort of see the logic here. I mean, if you're going to start something this revolutionary, you need to have all the pieces in place. It can't simply be changing one piece of the student experience. It all has to support itself.
Yeah, exactly. And places like Western Governors University or Calbright, they still have a lot of the old trappings of traditional education, like their financial aid system, right? You're awarded aid as a student based on the number of credits or classes that you take, which is ultimately a measurement of how many hours you sit in a classroom. What California is expanding to do is a financial aid system that has nothing to do with which classes you take or how many hours you spend studying for them. It's you get aid based on the skills that you can demonstrate you have learned in a class.
If I'm an education reporter and I want to write about this in my own state, my community, about competency based education, where am I going for the evidence? What are some of the research organizations that are looking at this? Where can I find numbers and data that I can trust?
This is new, so you're not going to get, the kind of government report that that might ground a lot, or like a government inquiry or something. There is a national group called the Competency Based Education Network. That was a great asset for me just to familiarize myself. There is some work happening at the federal government. There's more investments, nothing major, but the Biden administration is looking to competency based education really as a way to kind of keep our education system up to date and to ensure that we're training today's workforce rapidly. So there is some work happening in the federal government. If you're covering your state or community, I would definitely reach out to the Competency Based Education Network and see if there are any programs or colleges. By and large, this is happening everywhere. There was a study of about 500 colleges and universities that found 13% of them had already implemented a competency based model of some sort. And about half of those schools were in the process of implementing something. And while I was looking at what California was doing, I also heard rumors that Kentucky is on the front line trying to do something similar. I want to say Illinois is also looking at something. So there's really kind of whisperings about competency based education all across the country.
A major concern for higher education, and frankly for should be a concern for everyone, is how many students start college and don't finish, but also how many never actually get even to that opportunity, particularly those from underserved communities. Does competency-based education, is it billing itself as a potential solution when it comes to promoting educational equity?
It definitely does. Now, does it really achieve that? We just don't really know yet. What we know is that, at least from the colleges that I've looked at who have implemented this, we know that it does attract an older demographic. We know that it attracts a demographic that is definitely in the workforce. Now, does it attract a more diverse demographic? I don't know. So it's all kind of new. I think a lot of people, and certainly I heard this in California from state leaders, they're basically saying this is a radical new idea. Let's try it.
If I'm the education reporter and this has been landed on my desk, and where do I start? What are some questions reporters should be asking if they're writing about competency based education?
I think the real challenge with this topic is making it tangible for readers. It's very, very wonky. And even I struggle to try to explain it. As I was saying earlier, there's all these different kinds of competency based education, and the differences do matter. As I said, for instance, like whether your financial aid system is or is not based on the credit hour is important. But, the general public, do they really care? I don't know. I think that it's just important to try to think about like what's really happening. So ask yourself and ask sources, is there a program that I can visit? Is there a class I can shadow? Is there a student I can speak to? Because when you start talking to people, you might learn new things. I would also recommend talking to faculty because, as I mentioned, in California, we've got a lot of faculty who are concerned about the direction of this and many faculty who are enthused. But I think if you're looking for different perspectives, you might find faculty and faculty unions in particular can kind of share what this might mean for teachers.
What do we know about how the workforce is responding to this? Will employers know if their employee shows up with a certification that they went through a competency based program versus something traditional? Is there an asterisk anywhere on the transcript?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do to understand how this actually works was to visit a place where it's really happening in person and in the way that this next cohort of community colleges in California actually plans. So I went to Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, I started to really ask questions, those kinds of questions, to try to figure out, okay, how does this actually apply? Like, this sounds really applied. Are employers taking the bait? At least in Wisconsin, the data wasn't there yet. There was one funny example, though, that I'd love to share. So in Wisconsin, there's two community colleges. They're called technical colleges. They developed a new kind of transcript because the traditional transcript of letter grades doesn't really fit the competency based model. I mean, again, competency based is just about skills. It's not about whether you got an A, B, or C. So their new transcript is just skills. All it says is, these are my 10 or 20 skills. In theory, you'd think, or at least these colleges in Wisconsin thought, that would be great for employers. An A, what does that mean? But knowing that I know how to change a tire, that's a skill. However, employers didn't like it because they weren't familiar with it. And students didn't really understand it either. They still wanted the letter grades because that's the system we have. And so I think, one of the things that's interesting about competency based education, even though it, in theory, should be more applicable to employers, there's kind of a broader societal shift that needs to happen to ensure that it works at all of the different tiers.
Adam, you're on the community colleges beat. I'm wondering, are there any misconceptions about the set of schools you'd like to dispel, or maybe about the students or the programs?
My gripe is that people don't realize how big community colleges are and how important they are. The California community college system is massive. It's just short of 2 million students. It's like the largest higher education system in the country, and it dwarfs all of the other higher education systems in California that are pretty famous, like our UC system or our CSU system. And I just always like to hammer that point to say, hey, this is a massive, massive system. And when it comes to competency based education, the changes that California is proposing, they can have a really big impact on this, near 2 million students. So I wrote about, this one pilot that's going to take place in 8 colleges. And for context, there's 116 colleges in California. But, if that ultimately affects the whole system, it can affect a lot of people.
I'm curious, why was this the particular topic one that really grabbed you that you wanted to tell for your EWA reporting fellowship?
I have written a lot about how colleges have lost students, particularly older students, and about the efforts that those community colleges are making to try to get working adults back to school. And so I've always been looking at this. I wrote about how community colleges are trying to find students in prisons. I wrote about the expansion of dual enrollment, about marketing efforts, all of these things. And I realized I hadn't actually looked at what was happening in the classroom. I wanted to see if colleges were doing anything in the classroom to try to recruit these working adults. And I learned about competency based education, and I thought, whoa, that's a big deal. And I was surprised to see that California was actually on the cutting edge, trying to really scale up the scope of this new model.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing where this experiment goes and to following your continuing coverage, Adam. Thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Adam Echelman covers community colleges for CalMatters through a partnership with Open Campus. He previously covered issues of equity across Stanislaus County for the Modesto Bee. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line. We're at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.